We will have reform without undermining our many great and extremely talented law enforcement officers.
Looking at these numbers overall, we see that most Americans, about 6 in 10, feel that the killing of George Floyd is indicative of a larger problem of systemic issues with the way that police and the Black community interact. However, there's a couple key differences here that I think really underscore a larger division in our society right now. The first is if you look at this information by party ID, we see that Republicans are actually the only demographic group in this poll where a majority feel that it's just an isolated incident rather than a systemic issue. There is a significant gap between Republicans and Democrats on this issue. We're seeing that in some of our Ipsos polling about views toward the protests, views toward police brutality, and still, because there is a pandemic going on, views about the pandemic and how society should reopen. So it's really two separate Americas right now, I think, is what this poll is showing. There is just a huge gap on your views about racial inequality and police treatment of people of color, specifically Black Americans, depending on your political affiliation. Now, this poll also shows that there are some differences by race and ethnicity. So though a majority of white Americans still believe that George Floyd's death was indicative of a systemic issue, they're much less likely to believe this than Black Americans and other people of color. Again, I think it just goes to show that there is just really, in our society right now, a huge difference of perception, specifically on issues regarding race and policing, especially when you look at partisan affiliation and your racial or ethnic background.
In your poll, 57% of whites said that what had happened to George Floyd was part of a broader pattern. And I think that is just enormously significant to have a substantial majority of whites giving that response. And we've seen movement on that question in other polls in that direction. So your poll is very much in line with other polls that ask about whether this was an isolated incident or whether it was part of a broader pattern. And I think that's very significant for the reforms that Congress is going to be considering. We've heard a lot of people say, and I think it is certainly true, that public opinion on this issue has moved very fast. Much more support for Black Lives Matter in a number of polls. I think that is in fact significant, and just a much broader recognition that this is part of a broader problem. With 60% of Republicans saying that this is in fact an isolated incident, that may reflect more their belief that a lot of the people who were protesting this were actually looting and rioting. And of course, Republicans have always been more concerned about that overall. Most Americans tend to regard the police in their local communities generally favorably, and that is a cross-partisan identification, with Republicans being more supportive. And so I think it follows in a whole series of areas, and particularly in the responses to this question overall.